So, folks, yesterday, negotiations came right down to the wire to avert a government shutdown, and there's a lot of little mini stories within this story, one of which I think is quite funny. First, the big takeaway, especially as it relates to what we've been covering here in our section of this media space, is that the stopgap bill, the 45-day spending bill that was passed at the last minute through both the House and Senate, does not include aid to Ukraine. And so this is from the Washington Post. Alarm grows in Kyiv, Washington, as GOP House blocks Ukraine aid. Now, GOP House blocks Ukraine aid. This is because Kevin McCarthy needed a deal at the last minute. We should note, actually, more Democrats than Republicans voted for this bill in the end. Congress on Saturday moved to block new aid for Ukraine in its government spending deal, a rebuke to Kyiv with geopolitical reverberations that came despite a concerted lobbying push from senior Biden officials and the highest-ranking GOP senator. Although the White House said Ukraine needed $20.6 billion in aid to fight Russia's invasion, Speaker Kevin McCarthy stripped all funds for the U.S. ally from the government spending bill under immense pressure from a GOP caucus that has increasingly turned against Biden's handling of the war. The Senate had advanced a bipartisan bill to send roughly $6 billion to Ukraine, but Democrats, wary of being blamed for a government shutdown, were moving to approve the House version with only hours to go before federal appropriations expired. The rejection of the money, 9 days after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky flew to Washington and pleaded with lawmakers. Sorry, hold on 1 second. Let me set the mood here. The rejection of the money, 9 days after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky flew to Washington and pleaded with lawmakers to maintain their support, reflects hardening GOP opposition to helping Ukraine and will send immediate shockwaves through European capitals and the government in Kyiv. In the days leading up to the vote on the appropriations deal, top U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, made a concerted effort to build support for the package among Republicans, only for it to fall into the maw of resistance among House conservatives, who have been emboldened by former President Donald Trump and other GOP figures to oppose additional support. Ukraine supporters in the House, Senate, and White House say they will not give up despite the defeat, emphasizing that most members of Congress still support the additional funding. They also note that the stopgap spending bill moving Saturday will only fund the government until mid-November, providing another opportunity for pushing again for money for Ukraine. McCarthy's decision to move a bill without Ukraine funding came together suddenly, leaving aides at the state and defense departments to launch an unsuccessful last-minute lobbying campaign. Ukraine's biggest champions in the Senate quickly realized that they had few options. Okay, so we don't have to read the rest of that. Basically, this came together at the last minute, and even though, obviously, most Senate Republicans, just as all Senate Democrats, support aid to Ukraine, the Republicans realized that they were out of time, that they could either sign this or that there could be a shutdown. And I think part of the scramble to avoid a shutdown has to do with the fact that a federal government shutdown could gum up the courts for a while and maybe delay some of Trump's trials. And I don't think that's a headache that Republicans wanted to deal with going into 2024. They didn't want that over their head. So I think there was a special pressure to avert a shutdown here. But the way the timeline worked out, you basically had the Freedom Caucus here cuck the entire government. I mean, they just brought the entire government to heel. Every Democrat, with the exception of, I think, one, and I could even be wrong about that. I thought it was almost every single Democrat ended up voting for this bill, despite there being no aid to Ukraine. So the Democrats bailed McCarthy out, saying he wanted to be an adult at the last minute. And not only did the Democrats bail McCarthy out in the House, but then the Republican Senate realized there was no time left on the clock. They were out of options. They had no time to negotiate, no time to maneuver. They pushed it through So just an absolutely massive win for this tiny little Freedom Caucus, or squad, if you will. You see, that's how you wield power. Look at what they were able to do. They were able to cut aid to Ukraine. They were able to throw a wrench in the war machine. You know how hard that is to do? You know how difficult that is to do? Even if it's only for a few weeks, right? Because as we'll learn later, Matt Gaetz is now accusing McCarthy of making some secret backroom deal with Democrats to get Ukraine through anyway in the near future. Even if this only works for a couple weeks, just look at what a handful of Republican holdouts did to the military-industrial complex. They actually stopped aid for war. They stopped money for war. I never thought that was possible. I didn't think any politicians could do that, given the overwhelming bipartisan support for aid to Ukraine, but they did it. It's an amazing thing to have seen.
What really upsets me about it is who's thinking about the BMW and Mercedes dealers in Ukraine? Because this was very bad news for them.
Oh, yeah.
And I heard there's already been a wave of bankruptcies. Immediately on the news, several high-end sports car dealerships closed.
And that's just Mercedes and BMW. Wait till Volkswagen hears about this. They are especially not going to be happy. Oh, my God.
People's car, my ass.
Exactly, yeah.
This is crazy. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. This should be the squad doing this. I don't mean just holding the government hostage this way. They should be the one holding up spending bills because of Ukraine funding. That would be the left position. Now, I understand that the conservatives are coming at their anti-war stance more from a traditional libertarian perspective, that America should not be getting involved in foreign entanglements. It's not a peacenik thing. But at the same time, this is what's so crazy. You know, people come to you, well, we can't have the Republicans in charge. Can't we? Can't we? I mean, right. given these terrible fucking options, I don't know, man. The only people I'm seeing who are giving a voice to the journalists who published the Twitter files, the only people I'm seeing not sending the IRS to their house the day they testify in Congress, the only people I'm seeing trying to do anything to stop our involvement in this war are fucking Republicans. I mean, I'm not saying, well, you know what? Let's join. But if you were going to, and obviously we're not voting for either, but if you were forced into a choice, you can't really make a case for the Democrats, even from a left perspective, when you consider these factors. If you value freedom of speech and World War III makes you nervous, we are living in a crazy world where the Republicans are the party you could more justify voting for if those are your concerns.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, we were talking about this offline earlier, because it's not really like the Democrats were ever the party of peace or the Republicans were ever the party of peace. But it used to be the case back in the day that peaceniks happened to be Democrats, generally. Right. It's not that most Democrats were peaceniks or that Democrat politicians were peaceniks, but you ran into someone on the street and they were against the war du jour. Odds are they were Democrats or left aligned. Now that is not the case anymore. That's not the case anymore. Right. And I know. We don't have to get bogged down in the semantics of what constitutes a real leftist. I'm talking broadly speaking, what is generally perceived to be left of center here, right? It is not the case anymore that you can assume when someone says they're a lefty or they're a liberal or they're a Democrat that they are anti-war. In fact, just the opposite. Right. Just the opposite. Well,
yeah, like
and the opposite is true on the Republican side. You used to assume the Republicans were pro-Iraq war, pro-Afghanistan war 20 years ago, and you would assume that the Democrats were for at least some more peaceful version of, the quote-unquote war on terror, right? Whatever their position was. It was incoherent at the time. That's why they nominated, a pro-war opposition candidate to George Bush in 2004. But generally speaking, the mood on the left, in left of center circles, was anti-Iraq war. Now the mood in Republican circles is anti-Ukraine war.
Kerry was for it before he was against it.
That's right. He was for it and then against it. Exactly.
He was by the time he was running, he had decided he was against it. Yes, the Democrats as a party were not necessarily anti-war. LBJ is the one who escalated the Vietnam War into the horror that it became. But the party tore itself apart over that. The 1968 Chicago Convention, the rioting in the streets, was mostly about the Vietnam War. So it wasn't just a minor faction of the Democratic Party that was anti-war. It was an enormous portion. I mean, at least it was basically the Sanders coalition of its day, only with fucking balls. Right. The balls to go do that at the Democratic Convention. Today you're if you hear somebody's anti-war, you assume that they're Republicans, which is just it's just cats and dogs living together. We're living in a world where all the old political calculuses of who's right, who's left, they just don't mean anything anymore. And yes, let's not get bogged down in the semantics.
Please clap.